Open your ears and lube up your butthole. It's time for the What Do We Call It podcast. Now, here's your host. It's Jmann. Welcome to the What Do We Call It podcast. I'm Jmann. Once again, it's just me talking about some thoughts that I had while I was reading through the internet. And I had a watershed moment the other day while surfing Twitter. There was this woman named Laura Powell, and some shit that she said was trending. She's an attorney from California, and she had the following to say. If the massive increase in LGBT identification in recent years is a result of increased acceptance, then why aren't we seeing large numbers of Gen X and older people coming out of the closet?
I don't know!
And a fellow poster said this in reply. If I'm not mistaken, Gen X queers bore both the brunt of the AIDS crisis and the nasty wave of hate crimes born from it. Most of them didn't survive because that was the point of criminalizing their existence. But I'm sure if they did survive, they'd be happy to chat with you. And then somebody posted a picture with the following caption. And it's a photo showing a bunch of dudes, and it says, anyway, here's a pic of the San Francisco Gay Men's Choir with the only original members dressed in white, with the black suits representing all those who died from the AIDS epidemic. I just want to point out that I counted the heads, 124 pictured, 7 in white, the other 117 in black. And I just kind of went, holy shit. I think this fact gets left out of the equation when discussing LGBTQIA population makeup and how it's calculated. Like, we don't count the dead, do we? Like, I literally said out loud to myself, oh my God, how the fuck did I not consider that until now? Because I am an ally, and I'm on the pulse of this issue. I voted pro-gay marriage when it was on the docket here in Minnesota where I live. But when they talk about the increase in LGBTQ identification, nobody really goes, oh yeah, well, let's look at representation numbers by generation, right? Like, I did my 5th grade science fair project on AIDS, for fuck's sakes. And I was urged by my parents to do so because they were much more forward-thinking back in 1992. So I took all kinds of shit for doing that project, by the way, because it was a Catholic school and most people with AIDS were gay men then.
Guilty!
Like, for instance, Pedro Zamora from MTV's Real World San Francisco. It was like season 2 or 3. He's no longer around to tell his story of self-realization, coming out, and the struggle to be accepted. And I think it's very important to consider how many gay men and trans people died between 1981 and now from HIV and AIDS. Very sobering numbers. 40 million people worldwide, roughly, have died from HIV or AIDS since the beginning of the epidemic. And you just sit there and go, oh, holy shit, 40 million people. Well, I mean, there's 8 billion now, but still, population was different then. And as I'm thinking about, Gen X and boomers being left out of this conversation, I thought about this guy that I worked with at Target back in the day. We just called him BGD, for short, Big Gay Dave. He was the first gay person I ever really knew that was like out and open. And I was a teenager working in the stockroom, and he was our assets protection doorman. Word got out about his orientation just because he talked kind of like Big Gay Al from South Park, but he definitely had a more effeminate presentation. And a mustache, a rockin' gay dude mustache. Everything I'm saying about this guy, I hope comes across as positive because he was so fucking cool and so nice. He always used to chat up my mom and grandmother when they were in the store. He even once played a prank on my grandma where he put a security tag on her cart and acted like he caught her stealing just to fuck with her. That guy, so fucking cool. But like, people wondered what was his deal, and it got out, oh yeah, he's gay. And then he told somebody, oh, well, I don't really drive much, so I'd go down to the gay 90s and hang out and party all night, and then I'd give guys a blowjob to drive me home afterwards.
How you fellas doing?
Not a unique story in terms of how adult gay men acted around each other or with each other in the 90s.
Giggity.
No pun intended. The decade of the 90s, not just at Gay 90s, the bar. That last piece of info about Dave and his cocksucking, that's for context. I'm not trying to poke fun at him. All due respect. Don't know what happened to him. Hope if he's still alive, he's happy and safe. But the reason that he worked assets protection and didn't have another job that paid more money is he's like, oh, well, I'm well off. Most older gay men are because they've had older lovers that left them money when they died from AIDS. Now orientation is like a brand. That's why they slap a rainbow with pride on it on everything. But back in the day, that wasn't as prevalent. No, what we had to focus on what was going on were red ribbons for AIDS awareness. Like World AIDS Day. That kind of shit. Now it's just like almost a fucking brand, like a status symbol. So when you think about how many kids today seem to be jumping on the queer lifestyle bandwagon, I on one hand think a portion of them are doing it to fit in, and that's sad to me because of all the legitimately queer people who went through decades of shame and self-doubt while living in a nation they felt scared to be themselves in, especially like in the South. You know, like a good representation of art representing life would be Corporate Avengers' song, Jesus Christ Homosexual, which postulates that, well, God created man in his image, so God created gays, so maybe Jesus was gay. And that song was inspired by the murder of homosexual man Matthew Shepard in Laramie, Wyoming. So when you break down that they say what percentage of the population identifies as queer, like boomers are at 2.7%, Gen X is at 3.3%, millennials are at 11.2%, Gen Z is almost 20%. So how many of Gen A are going to end up that way? Because that's the cool thing for the younger kids right now, right, is to be different. So I would not be shocked if at some point we see 25% of the Generation A cohort identifying as one of the alphabet people. And I'm not against that. I'm just saying these are numbers. But look back at how little the boomers and Gen X are represented in all of this. You know, a lot of them died of AIDS. The ones that were gay men from those age groups, so many. And perhaps it's around 700,000, I think is the number, since 1981. It doesn't seem like a lot when you weigh it against the U.S. population of 339 million and change. But consider these numbers. In 1980, the U.S. population was 226.5 million. 1990, it only jumped to 248.7 million. 2000, 281.4 million. 2010, 308.7 million. And in 2020, 331,449,281 per the census numbers. So 700,000 people since 1981. That's going to account for everybody.
Hi.
But there's a lot of gay men and a lot of trans people in there. Why? Because it was a part of their community. It spread like wildfire due to all the unprotected sex. And then as Big Gay Dave told us all, you know, getting HIV is kind of like a rite of passage if you're an older gay man, because so many of us have it. And I don't know if he did. Like, I didn't fucking ask. And some of this stuff he's saying to one of the other security officers, who was one of my best friends at the store, who's passing it to me. But I remember these very distinct stories and facts.
Jesus Christ.
But then again, if you're looking at 700,000 in a 40-year span, I'm sure there's a slice of the pie that's made up of dipshit heroin junkies who share needles. But still, if you think that more acceptance of LGBTQIA people now is going to have older queer people coming out of the woodwork to announce their orientation, then you're forgetting that many have died. Many still aren't open to sharing their identity so boisterously because it wasn't celebrated back then. And then there's a certain percentage that don't identify that way anymore, not because they decided, oh, it was a phase. No, because they were forced by some right-wing Bible-thumping assholes to go to a conversion camp to pray away the gay. So chew on that for a moment, doubters. This is me saying, hey, so many people are identifying as this now because it's more accepted. So of course they're going to come out of the woodwork. But as the tweet from Laura Powell from the beginning of this episode here, Why aren't more Gen X and boomers coming out? Well, a bunch of them died from AIDS, and a lot of them remember how they were treated, and they're not too quick to forget that shit. So while they want to just be accepted, and many of them are slowly coming out of the woodwork, they're not like millennials or Gen Z or Gen A, who their gender identity becomes like their whole fucking identity. Like, here's who I am, here's my orientation, here's everything about me. No, there was a lot more subtlety to the public gayness back then. However, coming out of the closet was a huge fucking deal. And it used to be very, oh my God, what am I going to do? Am I going to be accepted? How is this going to go? For a lot of them. And the few kids that were in my high school that came out, they had supportive parents. I don't remember anybody saying that they were told they couldn't be that way or getting sent away to one of those fucking conversion camps. But still, that shit existed. There was that mindset back then. All these kids today are making these videos like, oh, I'm announcing my sexual orientation. I just want people to know. Like, how many famous motherfuckers have come out and be like, I'm queer, I'm bi, I'm pansexual, I'm non-binary. Like, it's more like a badge of honor than it is just a lifestyle that you live based upon your proclivities. It seems very hokey and fucking status symbol-y now, like they're attention whores. But you will always have that older generation of boomers and Gen Xers who just will have a lifetime of apprehension about being as open with that because they lived through much different times. And even though I didn't have classmates whose parents were throwing a shit fit about it, I'm willing to bet that for every one kid that came out of the closet to their parents and was accepted, 5 to 10 got a lot of flack for it. It's just the way things were. It wasn't as accepted by society, so parents were like, oh my God, what's wrong with my kid? But you have to really focus on the AIDS epidemic, and you don't hear about it anymore. It's not over. I mean, it's more controlled now. Amazingly, you'll see all kinds of ads on television for prevention medication for people that might be involved with somebody who has HIV. But that shit didn't exist then. We didn't see commercials for that shit on TV. If you were in the mid-90s and there was a gay character on your TV show, that was a big fucking deal. Now, if you don't have like 2 or 3, it's a fucking big deal that you're lacking representation. I remember the AIDS scare. I remember the big deal with Ryan White and him getting HIV from a blood transfusion. I remember when Magic Johnson was basically forced to fucking retire because everybody was scared that he'd give it to him from his sweat while playing the game. We didn't have the education. We didn't know everything that we do now, 30 years later, thankfully. But think about if we had, how many more people between the age of 40 and 65, gay men and trans people, would be around to tell their story. That is the point of this episode, is that I want you to think about anyone you know that is older, that is gay or lesbian. Even if you know a trans person too, it wasn't very common back then like it is now, where it's celebrated, but just think of their struggles. Think of how they're different in how they represent their orientation and gender identity versus how it is now, where you are going to wear that shit on your sleeve and it's going to be like a merit badge on a fucking Boy Scout sash saying, queer. I run a lot of rainbow stickers on cars when I was driving in high school and college. And that's the years of 96 through 05. It's a pretty big window of opportunity for me to see that shit. The gays were around. They were accepted. I never saw anybody get gay bashed. But you cannot forget the Gen X and the Boomer cohort and all their struggles while you're sitting here talking about how every kid gets to be who they want to be. Like, lest we forget the past generations that had to walk through a sea of hot coals and hell just to be who they were. So think about them and talk to them. Be like, hey, you ever think about how different it is now? I would love to have a guest that could come on and have that conversation. If I could find Big Gay Dave, I would be like, dude, come sit with me down in my basement and talk into this dick-shaped microphone about your life. Please. Wherever you are, Big Gay Dave, I miss you, bro. You were so fucking cool. And to everybody in your age group and like you that suffered and lost friends and family when you came out, that lost friends and peers from AIDS. You are not forgotten in all this positivity. Your struggle was not in vain. There are people like me that are old enough to remember all that shit, and we honor you. Interact with the show on Twitter at What Do We Call It? That is at What Do We Call It? You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/group/What Do We Call It podcast show. For the What Do We Call It podcast, I'm Jmann. And that's the end.